To see forward, we have to look backward. Such has been the method of all great advancement. Look back at the great advancements in history, and they were made by people who understood history. Think, for example, of Lincoln's famous Gettysburg Address. We all remember that it ends with government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. But that's just the ending of the speech. The beginning starts with history. 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. 407 years ago, of course, refers to 87 years of passage of time. So Lincoln was saying to his country that for them to go forward in freedom, a freedom that would involve, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, they needed to look back to 1776 and master their history and live up to the words of their forebears. So here today, as we discuss the ancient principle of judicial independence, we too must look backwards at our history to understand where from these principles originate. To go forward, we have to be able to look backward. Winston Churchill understood this. He was probably the most prescient statesman ever to live. His incredible clairvoyance is unmatched. And we all know the famous example. He, early in the 30s, predicted the comprehensive evil of Adolf Hitler, even when many others saw him as harmless. He called for a robust national defense to prepare for what he foresaw years in advance as Hitler's forthcoming aggression towards world domination. Now, how did he see forward? Well, he looked backwards. He understood history. We all know that he, at Fulton, Missouri, Westminster College in 1946, predicted the beginning of the Cold War. He spoke of an Iron Curtain descending over Europe. 1946, well before the rest of the world was even thinking about conflict with Stalin, who had been a World War II so-called ally. How did he see forward? He was able to look backward. He was able to look backward because he was the author of 58 volumes of Nobel Prize-winning literature, almost all of it on history. But for one or two, in what he admitted were failed attempts to write novels, he wrote almost exclusively about history. And when instructing young people at a commencement ceremony on what they must do to succeed in life, he gave them 3 pieces of advice. Study history, history, and history.
Yeah.
Now, the predictions that he made were not limited to the political realm. A lot of people don't know that in a 1931 Maclean's Magazine essay, 1931, he predicted the iPad. He said, in future years, men and women will be able to hold in their hands a device, and then he predicted Skype. He said they will be able to speak to someone on the other side of the world instantaneously as though they are sticking their head out the window and speaking to a neighbor. He said that these devices would be connected by a central device in a household, which we call routers or modems today. This is 1931. He predicted that humanity would one day unleash the extraordinary power of the atom for good and for evil. Again, this is over a decade before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He predicted the forthcoming conflict between free nations and socialist nations, which of course both manifested themselves in the Second World War, where we fought National Socialism in Germany and Italy, and in the Cold War, where we fought Marxist socialism. But again, he predicted this in 1931, decades before any of these events would actually come to pass. But you know what else he did in that essay, Madam Speaker? He explained his methodology for seeing the future. He actually gave kind of an IKEA instruction manual on how you can become a fortune teller. He said there are two ways to see ahead. Both of them involve looking backwards. One is the cyclical methodology, and that's one you use when you see events in the present that have existed in the past. You look where they ended up in the past, and then you can predict where they will again end in the future. Now, somebody says Gomery, pointing to the Liberal sponsorship scandal, and quite rightly, that history is now repeating itself with the SNC-Lavalin scandal.
So corrupt.
Then he said there was another methodology for seeing the future, and it was the trajectory model. And that is used for when you're trying to anticipate something that has never existed before. And I believe this is how he was able to foretell all of the technological advancements contained in that incredible essay. And he did it, this methodology involves seeing where things are, seeing where things were, where things are, and therefore projecting where they will be. But both of these methods, whether you use a circular view of history repeating itself, or a trajectory to judge where things have been, where they are, to imagine where they will be, involve looking backwards. This methodology makes sense with what we know about neurology. The human mind creates images for its imagination out of fragmented memories of the past. In other words, the things that we imagine in the future are the things that we have stored away in our memory from the past. And thus was he capable of taking that 58 volumes of literature that he had written, and the millions of words that he had read, and the countless historic events of which he had been a part, and was able, therefore, to take that knowledge and project it forward deep, deep into the future, seeing far beyond what anyone else could see. So that is, I say all of this, Madam Speaker, as a justification for delving deep into our own history in order to judge how we might proceed with this present-day controversy. Some members might be tempted to jump up on points of order as I look back at where our democracy came from and ask me the relevance, ask you to rule that I no longer be permitted to speak about our past because the past, according to some, no longer matters. But of course, I make these earlier remarks to tell you how very much our past matters and how much it can tell us about our future. This is a lesson that our current Prime Minister should learn. In his speech before the House of Commons some time ago, marking a great anniversary of the Parliament of Canada, he basically omitted the entire history of the Westminster system and spoke of Parliament as though freedom and democracy were just invented by his dad in 1982. But of course, we know that that kind of thinking is dangerous. Our history, we today stand on the shoulders of giants, that we here inherit something great from those who came before us, and that we must always remember, especially in the debate about the interference of political actors in our judicial system, that while our parliamentary civilization may be 800 years long, It is only 1 or 2 generations deep. In other words, if 1 or 2 generations decide to dispense with its hard and fast rules and replace them with some new modern invention rooted in nothing but symbolism, selfies, and sobbing speeches, then we very much will be living in a house resting on sand, Madam Speaker. Now, speaking of sand and sandstone, I see a lot of it all around us here today. We are inside the courtyard of the former West Block building, a building whose exterior has always been clad with sandstone. That, of course, because sandstone tends to be more resistant to the weathering effects of our brutal Canadian climate. Now, that being said, we used to meet in another place called Centre Block. And in Centre Block, when you're inside the building, you actually bear witness to a different stone, limestone. Limestone from Manitoba, someone very patriotically yells out from across the way. And he should take great pride in that limestone. It is literally part of Canada. It is exhumed from the ground and builds up the democratic institutions that we now enjoy in Canada's parliamentary system. And while you walk around that old Centre Block building, you might see a number of different substances. You might have seen before we moved the white oak desks that we have here, solid as oak. You might go into the library and see the beautifully ornate and well-carved pine, polished brilliantly, resplendent before the eyes of every astonished visitor. You might look up at the gilded dome, and there you would see gold looking back down at you. You might look down at the ground and see the cherry, oak, and walnut wood on which our feet walk. And all of those elements are beautiful. But for me, what matters most is the stone, the limestone. The limestone takes us back in time. As you walked into the basement of the House of Commons building, the Centre Block building, you could walk millions of years into history. Inside those stones are fragments, skeletal fragments of marine life, compressed and piled millions of times under unimaginable, nearly infinite pressure to create this stone. You can literally witness seashells in the walls, staring right back at you. Those seashells would have been sliced in half by a stonemason in the 19th century, or perhaps in the early 20th century as Parliament was rebuilt following the World War I era fire. But either way, though in those stones is the story of time, and there are 2 parts to that story. The first part is that limestone is solid and, to our eyes, unmoving, a perfect symbol of the institution that it is that stone is used to build up. And it should be so. But also in that same stone is evidence that nature, all nature, including geological nature, including the rocks and stones we see as indestructible, are always in transformation, that they always risk erosion, that one object today was a different object long ago, and that we must always work every day to preserve what we have, so that that stone may never erode that these oak desks may never be nibbled away by termites, and that the institutions that took so long for us to build up shall never be allowed to disintegrate piece by piece. And that is why this debate is so important. Changes, the disintegration of great civilizations don't just happen with a sudden bang. You know, they say Rome wasn't built in a day, and that's true. But it wasn't destroyed in a day either. It took almost half a millennia from the time Julius Caesar converted the Roman Republic into an empire, and himself from consul into an emperor, until the Roman Empire disintegrated and was sacked and defeated. So, an early decision can slowly eat away and wear down the once mighty and apparently indestructible institutions that give rise to the people in the first place. Thus, we must be so vigilant and on guard whenever they come under attack. And the former Attorney General has said that our core institutions faced such an attack from the Prime Minister of Canada. She testified that he personally and politically tried to interfere with a criminal prosecution. Our institutional history is one that separates court from Parliament, judge from Prime Minister, and deliberately so. We understand that as soon as the politicians start to mess with the courtroom, then we will go from the rule of law to the law of rulers. And this history is encapsulated in stone. And I have here a beautiful book, which I'm not allowed to hold up because of parliamentary rules, by Eleanor Milne, Captured in Stone, Carving Canada's Past. And if you walk through the old Centre Block building, there you will find beautiful carvings chiseled in the wall that tell us of where we came from. I quote, "East Wall, Set 1, the first inhabitants of the North American continent. In the Bluefish Caves of northern Yukon, archaeologists have found evidence of the use of stone tools between 2,500 and 12,000 years ago. And the images of that life is carved in the wall with Inuit people carrying out their hunting traditions. You can go forward, the native people who greeted the Vikings in the year 900 and 1000. And then, of course, we have images in the center stone of John Cabot holding up a scroll in his left hand and a tiller in his right. We have, of course, elsewhere, the first merchant ships to navigate the St. Lawrence River on the center stone. We have Samuel de Champlain, the founder of Quebec City, when he encountered an Aboriginal guide willing to lead him inland. We turn forward and we see that on the left panel, the first colonies of 1763, and on the center stone, a family of European settlers establishing a homestead. We see also carved in the wall the great surveyor, David Thompson, interacting with our Indigenous people. And finally, on the north wall, Set 3, the long road to freedom and justice is engraved there, Madam Speaker. And all Canadians who have not seen it should make haste to do so when the Centre Block reopens. And there is described, as I quote from this great book, "A strong figure is breaking chains, freeing doves. This speaks a symbolic language stating that those who come to this land to begin anew must leave all rage and bias behind." Now, why do so many people come to this land? And why are they so successful when they get here? Why is it that so many peoples of the world live in such squalor over there, and yet when they come here, the very same people, they enjoy such prosperity over here? We can't say that it's anything unique about our makeup as a species. We're just the same as the rest of the world. In fact, we are the peoples of the world. Literally, we are a reflection of the world because of our long-standing and successful tradition of high levels of immigration.
Point of order.
That long history that brings us to this moment tells us why so many people from so many far-off lands make the journey here, and why it is that they're so successful here when their lives were so much poorer elsewhere. So what is it that makes life so different here than it was over there? Is there something in the water? Is the air different? Why are we as a nation so prosperous when so many others suffer so greatly? Well, I look to the great Wilfrid Laurier for the answer. He was once asked to comment on Canada's nationality. And even then, it was a seemingly impossible task. If he were in France, he would say French. If he were in England, he would say English. If he were in Scotland, he would say Scottish. But of course, here in Canada, by his time at the beginning of the 20th century, we were all those things and much more. He could not define us by ethnicity, by language, by religion. In fact, he himself, though a French Catholic, read the King James Bible and therefore was probably even able to make his own identity known based on religion. So how is it that he identified the Canadian nationality? He did so in these simple words: Canada is free, and freedom is its nationality. Canada is free, and freedom is its nationality.
Amen.
From whence did that freedom come, though? That was the next question he needed to answer. Now, of course, he was a proud French Canadian who mixed very easily with people of other backgrounds. He said famously that when he was speaking about his time in school, he said, I had schoolyard fights with the Scottish boys and made schoolboy love with the Scottish girls. In other words, he grew up with Scottish kids even though he was French through and through. And his identity of Canadian freedom was actually British, even though his lineage was French. He said this other quote that I'll never forget of French Canadians: France gave us life, and Britain gave us liberty. I say that to explain that the inheritance of British parliamentary democracy, of the House of Commons, of common law, and of so many other principles of British history, that they are the inheritance of all people who live in this land, not just those who have an ethnic lineage back to Britain. In other words, we all inherit it. Even though I'm not English, I inherit these English liberties just the way Laurier said that he did too. And what are these English liberties and how did they originate? Well, they started with the Magna Carta in 1215. May of 1215, the angry barons gathered in the fields of Runnymede. They were taxed to the max after years of crusading kings pillaging and plundered. They were tired of the crown's tyranny, and they were determined to reverse it. And they forced King John, against his will, to sit and sign the Great Charter, or Magna Carta, as it is called. Now, as you look through the Magna Carta's roughly 60 clauses, you might find them a little bit arcane. There's talk of scutage and fish weirs and other arcana that might not seem relevant in the present. But there's a whole lot more that is. You think of let me read some of the excerpts from that great document. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will he proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals and by the law of the land. What does that mean? No arrest without charge, no conviction without trial. I think that's pretty relevant today, isn't it? Let me try another one. He shall do this without destruction or damage to men or property. If we have given the guardianship of the land to a sheriff or to any person answerable to us for the revenues, he commits destruction or damage, we will exact compensation from him. Many important things here. One, if we have given the guardianship of the land to a sheriff. In other words, only a civil authority approved with a democratic mandate must have the ability to arrest or do damage to property, and in that case, there must be compensation if such damage or such arrest was not justified. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals and by the law of the land. That, of course, does not only speak to arrest, but property rights. And to this day, we state clearly that the Crown may not dispossess someone of his or her belongings absent compensation for doing so, or without lawful judgment of equals, or by the law of the land. In other words, arbitrary expropriation is forbidden. And then let me just once again pull another incredible invention out of that same statement. Except by the lawful judgment of his equals. In other words, jury trials have their origins right here in this sacred text. So don't tell me that these old parchments are a relic of the past and we should forget about them and Canada was invented in 1982. These are ancient English liberties that are our inheritance and no one can take them away. Here's one that's particularly relevant to this debate. I hope the Prime Minister's listening to this. To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice. I look first at that starting clause. To no one will we sell. It doesn't matter how many billions are in SNC-Lavalin coffers, how many lobbyists it can send scurrying about Parliament Hill, how many illegal donations it can make to political parties, how many prospective job offers it can throw around, no matter how much it flexes its financial muscle, we will not sell them justice. Justice is not for sale.
Hear, hear.
It goes on. To any man whom we might have deprived or dispossessed of lands, castles, liberties, or rights without the lawful judgment of his equals, we will at once restore these. In other words, the Crown must compensate for what the Crown has taken away. All of these customs and liberties that we have granted shall be observed in our kingdom insofar as concerns our own relations with our subjects. Let all men of our kingdom, whether clergy or laymen, observe them similarly in their relations with their own men. In other words, clergy and laymen alike, Crown or subject, all must follow the law. And then I bring your attention, of course, to the most important of all. To all free men of our kingdom, we have also granted for us and our heirs forever all the liberties written out below, to have and to keep for them and their heirs, for us and our heirs. Madam Speaker, we are those heirs. We have inherited this. These are our liberties. They belong to us. And the people of our country, the common people, have delegated us to this chamber to protect those liberties. Thus, the ferocious response from the Canadian people that has surprised so many political observers to the scandal that currently rages inside this government. You know, a lot of people have said, why is it that people are so upset? It is a debate over text messages and emails and he said and she said and prosecutorial independence. How often do you hear that discussed at the water coolers of the workplace in Canada? Why is it that Canadians have resounded so strongly to this particular scandal? Well, the answer is because this scandal is not that complicated. It's actually quite simple. It is based on one simple rule that everyone understands from childhood in Canada, and it is this: we are all equal before the law. And this too had its imperfect origins in the Magna Carta. Because at the moment that King John signed that parchment, he conceded for the first time in the known history of our system that he, as the king, was no longer above the law. At that moment, Crown became subject to the law, and no one, not even the king, was above the law. Everybody understands that we're all equal before the law, and that if a homeless man is charged with stealing a loaf of bread, he can't simply knock on the Prime Minister's door and say, please make the prosecutor go light on me, sir. He faces a trial, either by a judge or a jury, and a verdict is rendered based on the facts, the precedents, and the law. And if it must be so for a homeless man charged with taking a loaf of bread, it sure as hell must be so for a powerful international corporation charged with corruption. People understand that money already has too much influence in most Western democracies. We don't need it to have more influence in the judicial system. We don't want two legal systems, one for the people and another for the powerful. We don't want justice to be for sale. We don't want the politicians to tell the judges or the prosecutors what they can and should do. That is a basic principle dating back. Now, one of the reasons why, you look at the British North American Act, and you know what I noticed when I read it, Madam Speaker? That there's none of the soaring language that you witness in the Declaration of Independence or even in the U.S. Constitution. There was no Thomas Jefferson who sat down with feather and drafted up words that we all remember or that we etch or repeat other than peace, order, and good government. And why was that? And the answer, of course, is that we understood, our founding fathers understood, that they didn't need to write out all of our freedoms at that moment in time because it was accepted that we would inherit those that came from the Mother Parliament. and from the Magna Carta. Now, it has been a positive development, I will say, that we have since written them out in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But that charter was merely a continuation of a then 7.5 century tradition that came before it. It was a continuation of the Bill of Rights, brought before Parliament by John Diefenbaker. But it was a continuation of everything that began in that field at Runnymede so long ago. And we are a nation not of revolution, but of evolution, where our friends south of the border spilled much blood to achieve their independence. We as a country almost had to be gently pushed out the door by the mother country. Of course, back in the early 30s with the Statute of Westminster, we were given full judicial independence, and yet for decades we would continue to go back to the British Privy Council as our Supreme Court. In other words, they were offering Canada more independence than we were prepared to accept.